It's late one Friday evening, and Ryan takes a walk in the park to get some fresh air before heading home, meditating for half an hour, and then starting working on his podcast. Ryan has been working on creating his podcast for the past year, but no real progress is being made. He spends his days at work, leading the creative department in a marketing agency, and he spends his evenings working on his podcast. At the marketing agency, the team grows uneasy because they never seem to meet Ryan's incredibly high standards. He's very critical of his colleagues and of himself, and he starts to spot mistakes even when there aren't any. At home, progress on the podcast is really slow, as Ryan tends to do all of the work himself and is almost never satisfied with the end results. Ryan has always been a high achiever, but after he started working at the marketing agency, his standards became higher than ever. Whenever appointed a task, he always strived to complete it to the highest standard. He would spend enormous amounts of time trying to perfect his work. Success was never enough for Ryan, and he always found ways to aim higher. This led to his promotion, and he was appointed the creative department lead. At the beginning, Ryan's team liked that he pushed them and believed that they could always do better. They showed good results and wanted to be better. But after some time, things started to get complicated and the team started to become more stressed. It seemed that Ryan was never happy with their work and thought that he could do their tasks better himself. When a member of the team confronted him about it, he got really defensive and told them they weren't putting in their best efforts. Ryan's approach was all or nothing, and he left no room for suggestions from others, mistakes, or tasks done less than perfectly. This was his attitude towards himself, and he expected the same from others. When things were wrapped up for the day at the agency, he looked forward to going home and continuing with his day. His routine was set up perfectly. After getting home, he always had dinner, took a shower, and went for a walk in the park. He brainstormed ideas for his podcast while walking, and after an hour, he would go back home and spend the next half an hour meditating. This was usually very late in the evening and when he started working on his podcast. Ryan had wanted to create a podcast about the art of marketing for the past year, but things were not going as he imagined. He spent huge amounts of time focusing on the end result and forgot to enjoy the process of creating something new. At first, he couldn't come up with a name for the podcast that was good enough for him. It was either too ordinary for him or it was something that already existed. When he would finally come up with one, he thought that he could come up with another, better one. So he kept changing it, and this slowed down his progress. This was the situation with every part of creating the podcast. For example, he decided to have a co-host and spent weeks trying to find the perfect one, but nobody met his impossibly high standards. So after some time, he changed his mind and decided to host the podcast by himself. Yet he was still spending a lot of time without progress being made, so he knew he had to change something. He did some research and decided to sign up for an online course titled How to Start a Podcast, which offered a step-by-step guide to creating your first podcast. Ryan attended the first part of the online course and tried to follow the steps. But as he continued, he started to always have some remarks about the process. It was either that he didn't agree with the concept of the course, or he thought that his way was quicker and better, or that he already knew all that they were trying to teach him. After some time, Ryan decided to quit the course because he thought that he could do a better job by himself. Soon afterward, he realized that he was not happy with his work on the podcast. At the agency, Ryan's team was not happy with him as he was never happy with their performance, and work started to become more and more stressful. Ryan was starting to get desperate because nothing seemed to be going right for him. His podcast and his work at the agency started to suffer, and soon after, his routine did as well. He couldn't meditate, he didn't go on his daily walks as he was stuck tinkering with things about the podcast, and he started to procrastinate. It was not an easy time for Ryan, but he didn't want to give up on his goals. He then decided to hire an assistant to help get the podcast off the ground. For a couple of weeks, things seemed to be going all right, and Ryan tried to collaborate and train a new team member. But Ryan was a hard person to work with, and an even harder person to please. He failed to recognize the hard work that she was putting into the job, and he was not happy with her. When she came up with solutions about his problems or suggestions about how to make the podcast better, Ryan always thought that he could do it better. He criticized every step of her work and found mistakes even when there weren't any. Nothing she did could meet Ryan's perfect standards, and eventually she decided to stop working for Ryan. This way, Ryan was right back where he started, on his own and with no progress on his podcast. He thought that nothing and no one could help him. One day, Ryan was invited to a party by one of his friends. At the party, one of his friends started to talk about a conference that he was planning to attend. He thought about it the next day and came to the conclusion that it would be a great opportunity to learn something new. A couple of days later, Ryan and his friend showed up at the conference together. In the conference, he heard something that grabbed his attention, and that was the concept of setting realistic goals and expectations. This is it, Ryan thought to himself. I need to become more realistic if I want to make progress in my life. He was confident that that was the approach that would change him for the better. After the conference ended, Ryan was excited to go home and put the things he learned into practice. In the conference, he learned that if people want to make progress in their life, they have to become more realistic with their standards and expectations. He remembered 3 key points: adjusting standards, allowing mistakes, active listening. The first thing Ryan did was to hire a podcast assistant producer and let go of trying to control all they did. He also made sure to adjust his standards and set more realistic goals for himself and his team. Ryan started to accept mistakes, both in the creation of the podcast and at the agency. Whenever a mistake did happen, he saw it as a chance to learn from it and grow, individually and as a team. Also, Ryan started to actively listen to his fellow colleagues. He listened to his podcast assistant and his creative department team. Only a few months later, Ryan's life was changed for the better. His work at the agency and his relationship with the team improved, which led to another promotion and an increase in salary. At home, Ryan was finally able to fulfill his dream and launch his podcast. After doing the first few episodes, he really fell in love with podcasting and changed his goal from doing 1 episode per week to 2. His podcast was a great success, and Ryan was happier than ever. Ryan realized that the only reason why he was not making any progress in life was his extreme perfectionism. But after applying the 3 key points that he learned at the conference, things started to change for the better. By adjusting his standards, allowing mistakes, and actively listening to the people around him, Ryan was able to overcome his perfectionism.